All right, I've realized that I have to speak a little louder on these things. I'm not using a microphone. I don't want to get too close. Today is Wednesday, and in the future I will get this kind of lecture on online in Blackboard sooner in the week. I've been having, I have to learn a lot of stuff. I was just learning how to clip the videos so that you don't see my thumb going for the on-off button. Again, I'm Professor St. Clair. This is meant for the 3 History 131 sections. The first chapter is chapter 15. The subject is Reconstruction. And I'm using an older edition of the textbook. So I'm not sure that everything that's in here is in the 9th edition, but what they sent me was this weird, it looks like it should have 3 holes. It only has 2 holes. It's very unwieldy. It's very hard to work with. So I'm not going to work with that. Plus my underlinings are in this version. So Reconstruction is pretty incredibly important in U.S. history. Yeah, straighten that out a little bit. It seals the fate of African Americans, particularly in the South, but has its effects throughout the nation. In that it's another 100 years or 90 years until African Americans can actually vote again. And during that time in the South, they suffer the segregation laws, which are like apartheid. They can only live in certain places. They can only drink from certain water fountains. They go to inferior schools. Certain neighborhoods are black neighborhoods. You hear all these stories like from the 30s and 40s of bands like Duke Ellington's band couldn't find, they'd tour the South and not be able to find a hotel that the band could stay in, and they had to find private homes in the black sections of town to stay. The movie 42 has a scene where Jackie Robinson has to stay in private homes as the Dodgers are traveling around. And it's a period of U.S. history that is very controversial because many of the people that think of the South as having been right in the Civil War, and there's a lot of them, want to pretend that the actual period of Reconstruction from like 1865 to 1877 was a disaster, a complete disaster. They were suffering under the rule of Negroes, and federal troops were oppressing everybody and this kind of thing. And it's kind of, I hate to use this term, but it's fake news. That's fake news. For that brief period, once the 15th Amendment is passed, black males have the right to vote, and they elect all sorts of people to Congress. There's a black man in the Senate from Mississippi. I posted that picture of the members of Congress. But at the state level, the state legislature and all sorts of local posts, African Americans are elected officials. But at no point were the number of black elected officials proportional to the number of blacks in the population. So it was never a thing like where the African Americans had the majority. Okay. Now at the end of the Civil War, actually beginning in the Civil War, there is people start to formulate. Well, what are we going to do about these, what they call freedmen, okay, ex-slaves? And they call them freedmen because they're not sure if they're going to be citizens or what the case, what their status is going to be. Okay, and part of the problem is, and I know this goes back a lot further than the Civil War, but the Constitution, when it was written and ratified in 1787, has 3 sections that point to slavery without using the word slavery or slave. Okay? There's a 3/5 compromise that says slaves will count as 3/5 of a person. So you take the population of the slave population of Virginia and divide it by 3/5, and that gets added to the population of Virginia. Okay? So they get more representatives, which means they get more electoral college votes, which means throughout the South, most white voters, their vote has a little more oomph, a little more power. Okay. There's another section in the Constitution where Congress is forbidden to end the slave trade, the international slave trade, until 1808. It gives the slave owners 20 years to import slaves. They mostly came from the Caribbean, I think, but import slaves to keep the price of slaves low and keep the supply of slaves up. Okay. And then there's a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. And none of these mention slaves, but the way it's worded, they couldn't be talking about anybody else. Okay. So you get to the Civil War, and in the middle of the Civil War, Lincoln proposes the Emancipation Proclamation, and he proclaims it on January 1st, 1863. It doesn't free all the slaves. In fact, at that moment, it doesn't free any slaves. What it says is that the slaves in the Confederacy are freed, excepting the slaves that are in areas of the Confederacy controlled by the Union Army, and accepting the slaves in the 4 states that are Union states, but also slave states. Okay, that's Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. All Union states, all states with slaves. So on January 1st, 1863, no slaves are actually freed. But as soon as the Union troops move from the positions they're in at that point into the South, those slaves in the Confederacy are freed, and they begin to follow after the Union Army, run away from their plantations if the Union Army is close by, follow the Union Army around. It becomes really a refugee problem, and the response by the government is to create something called the Freedmen's Bureau, under the control of the Army, and they try to set up schools to free slaves. Well, schools to educate, feed and clothe people, and in part of Georgia, there's actually a plan to distribute plantation land to blacks, and make it, let it be their land, right? There's a sort of motto, 40 acres and a mule. The idea was each family would get 40 acres of farmland taken from plantations, and an Army surplus mule from the Army. And with that, they would be able to build up, their wealth and give themselves a livelihood and not have to work for anybody else, that kind of thing. And that does go on to a certain extent in places. But once the states start coming back into the Union, the Constitution doesn't allow the government to take property and give it to somebody else without, some kind of process, some kind of legal process. And once Lincoln is assassinated and Johnson becomes president, he's sympathetic to the landowners, the white landowners, and they reclaim their land. Okay. So there's basically three plans for Reconstruction. Lincoln has a plan that's very mild. It only asks that 10% of the voting population in 1860 takes a loyalty oath, and then you can go ahead and have an election to a constitutional convention, writes a constitution, and you set up a state government. Okay. Lincoln also, he's the great emancipator, but he's a man of his times, and he doesn't propose that they give the vote to every black male. He's thinking there need to be requirements for blacks to vote. They have to be educated, or property owners, or have served in the Union Army. I don't know, white voters don't have those restrictions, but that was Lincoln's plan. The people in Congress are kind of opposed to this plan, so they come up with a more radical plan. They want a majority of the voters to take a loyalty oath. They send it to Lincoln right before they're going to adjourn, and he does what's called a pocket veto. He just puts it in his pocket, I guess. And once Congress adjourns, that bill is dead, and they'd have to start it up again. In the meantime, Lincoln gets assassinated, which causes quite a bit of hysteria in the North. And I must have read these dates a lot of times, but it's only like 5-6 days after the surrender of Lee to Grant that Lincoln is assassinated. So it's like the last act of the war. So, and you can see how that would make people a little hysterical. Now, Congress is filled with Republicans. When the way politics at that time was, the Democrats were part of the Solid South. Almost every white voter in the South voted for Democrats. Okay? And the Republican Party was fairly new, but they had a great deal of support in the North. They're both like sort of regional parties, although the Democrats have large groups of immigrants in big cities, particularly the Irish are Democrats. When those states pull out, secede from the Union, they take their congressmen and their senators with them. So the Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives become dominated by Republicans. And not every Republican is a radical Republican, but there are conservatives, there are moderates, and there are radical Republicans. And the radical Republicans sort of gain strength through this whole process. The very first elections by the southern states, they send the vice president of the Confederacy to Congress. They send all these military leaders of the Confederate Army to Congress. And Congress just refuses to seat them because they're traitors. But that kind of infuriates the Republicans. And then also the Southerners start passing things called black codes, which are kind of a bold attempt to restore slavery. There's a little loophole in the 13th Amendment which abolishes slavery. It says you can convicts and people that have been, suffered an indictment and found guilty in court and sent to prison can be leased out to private operators so that they can exploit them for their labor. And what starts to happen in the South, people get arrested for vagrancy, which is hanging around with no money, which is the condition of a lot of black people at that time. Sent to jail or fined, and then they have to work off their fine by working for somebody. The black codes often also said that you couldn't own land, a black person couldn't own land, and you couldn't do any job but agricultural work and domestic service, maids and that kind of thing. And that really annoys and angers the Northerners, okay? So they begin pushing through. They have the 13th Amendment that emancipates the slaves. They pass a 14th Amendment, I think in 1866, that makes anybody born in the United States a citizen, which includes all of the African Americans in the South. Okay? It's the first definition of U.S. citizenship in the Constitution, the 14th Amendment. And then the 15th Amendment says at least the males have voting rights. You can't abridge those voting rights. And for a while there's a period, I mentioned before, of blacks voting under the protection of federal troops. They almost always vote Republican. The party of Lincoln, the party of emancipation, makes perfect sense. But then towards the end of the 1870s, a couple of things start to happen. One is that Northern Republicans start to lose interest in the South and the cause of African Americans. And they kind of, we passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, so our job is done. And they move on to Western expansion or something else, okay? And then in 1876, there's an election where Rutherford B. Hayes is running against Samuel J. Tilden. Tilden is the Democrat, Hayes is the Republican. Tilden's from New York, Hayes is from Ohio, I believe. Okay. It's one of these elections where the popular vote and the electoral college vote are different. Plus there's a dispute over, Louisiana, South Carolina, maybe another southern state, and Oregon on their electoral votes. Who gets those votes? And there's all sorts of attempts to work it out in committees and stuff like that, but the committees continue to vote on party lines, and nobody's getting anywhere. And then finally there's sort of a backroom negotiation, which is pretty common, I think, in 19th century politics. And the compromise is this: Rutherford B. Hayes gets to be the president. He gets the White House. But the Southerners demand that he puts at least one Southerner in his cabinet, which is a big deal, kind of, and it's probably reasonable. But they're just coming back into the Union from this, 1877, it's not that close to the war. But so they get somebody in the cabinet. They get some help for a railroad in the Texas and something railroad, and then Hayes promises to withdraw the federal troops from the South, and that basically says blacks in the South are on their own, and whites in the South can handle this situation however they like, right? And it's It's considered the end of Reconstruction, 1877. And what you get after that is this different, a South where blacks are still second class, if not enslaved. They're not enslaved, but their ability to operate as a free citizen is strictly limited, and it's most blacks are forced into a situation called sharecropping, where you have to you kind of borrow a mule, a plow, the seed, the food that you're going to eat, the clothes that you're going to wear throughout the whole year. And then when you bring in the harvest, you share it with the owner of the land. You're like a tenant, and your landlord takes part of the crop, sometimes half, sometimes maybe more, sometimes maybe less. And then you get to sell the other part. And then you have to pay off your bill at the general store or wherever you're getting your food and that kind of stuff. And maybe you have a little money. I don't know when the cotton harvest is, but let's say you have a little money through October, and then you're right back on, signing the ledger every time you go in to buy groceries. It becomes a cycle of debt that is really, really hard to get out of. If you have a couple of bad years, you're kind of sunk. I've read stories where as late as the 1940s, black families are just going in the middle of the night on a train to get to Chicago or Detroit or someplace to get out of this situation. Now, in this book, it says a funny thing about how people had the sense, here it is. As tenants and sharecroppers, blacks enjoyed at least a physical independence from their landlords and had the sense of working their own land, even if in most cases they could never hope to buy it. Which I think is funny. I don't know what that means, the sense of having their own land, even though they could never hope to buy it. Usually when I'm in the classroom, I'll ask, anybody rent an apartment here? And somebody will say, yeah, I rent my. I said, when are you going to put in that $5,000 kitchen? I'm not planning to put in a kitchen. I said, why not? She said, they'll say, I don't own the place. If you rent an apartment, you're not going to make big improvements and stuff like that. The same thing with land, okay? And you end up having to grow a cash crop because you have to pay, it has to be, it's all money. You have to pay these things off, okay? Now, there's some sections in here about shifting incomes and credits, advances in education. This is an important thing. There's a section called the Reconstruction governments. And I alluded to this earlier, that there were a lot of black people in office, but nowhere were blacks sort of dominating the political scene, right? And nowhere were they, did they have as many representatives as their proportion of the population. But Southerners have made this argument that the governments under Reconstruction that had black people in them were corrupt. They were spendthrift. They spent money like crazy. And the black politicians were only in it so they could get fancy clothes and, this, that, and the other thing. Probably something about white women, I don't know. And when I was looking for the cartoons that I posted, there were quite a few of them that depicted that. A scene in the State House someplace with chickens and people fighting and all this kind of stuff. But in fact, there was no more corruption in the Reconstruction governments than in the northern state governments, local governments, and no more than in the pre-war southern governments, right? Corruption's just corruption. It's sort of inevitable, all right? And the expenditures, yes, they were spending money, but it was for things that the South had never spent money on before. Education, roads, things that help the community and build up the state, you know? So it's a weird argument, but it is an argument that is made. Okay. There's some sections in here. I did say that you didn't have to read the Grant administration. There's some corruption there, the whiskey ring and some other things. I think Grant is one of these people. He was a much better general than he was a president. But even as a president, he wasn't terrible. It's under Grant that the 14th Amendment gets passed. And before that, there's the first Civil Rights Act in 1866 that is aimed at suppressing the Klan. So he does do some good things. Now, once the troops are taken out, you have parts of the South where Mississippi, for instance, blacks are the majority. If blacks are allowed to vote, the one senator is from Mississippi. If blacks in Mississippi are allowed to vote, they can control the state. Same thing in South Carolina. In other states, it's closer to 50-50 or 40-60 or something like that. So there's an effort to keep blacks from voting. And you do it, basically, it starts with basic terror, okay? The Ku Klux Klan shows up at your house, burning a cross and threatening to burn your house down and burn your family if you don't either not go to the polls or when you go to the polls, vote Democratic, okay? But probably more effective than that is the economic pressure. Okay? You're either a worker, a sharecropper, or somebody that needs credit from a general store. And the landlord is white, the employer is white, and the general store is owned by a white person. Okay? And they basically lay down the law. He said, well, there's no secret ballot, so if you continue to vote Republican, I'll have to evict you from this land. Or if you continue to vote Republican, I'll have to fire you from this job. Or if you continue to vote Republican, I won't be able to extend you credit at the general store. Right? And those become life and death issues. If somebody still has a desire to go to the poll and vote, you're likely to find the polling place surrounded by hoodlums, white hoodlums, with guns and stuff. That cartoon that I posted, I don't think that's far-fetched. Maybe a little, but the two white guys have guns pointed at the black man's head, and he's saying something like, I'm definitely going to vote Democratic, vote for a Democrat. And that's how it's done. And a little bit later, in order to sort of keep in line with the 15th Amendment, which says you can't deny the vote on the basis of race, they come up with things like literacy tests, poll taxes, a clause that says unless your grandfather was a voter, you can't vote, which in the 1880s meant almost all black people couldn't vote. And it's important to keep this in mind because we see in this election coming up, people talking about sending poll observers to the polls to make sure there's no fraud. Okay, that's very similar to a bunch of ruffians hanging out in the South in the 1870s, 80s. Okay, very similar. Now the other, I don't want to go on too long because it's one of my weaknesses. So I'm going to leave a lot of this stuff out. I do want to mention Booker T. Washington. He will become important. It seems to me in the history of African Americans since the Civil War, there are two main strategies for attaining civil rights. Okay? And it changes from time to time, but one of the early ones is Booker T. Washington, who says basically, he gives a speech that comes to be known as the Atlanta Compromise. He says blacks should forego agitation for political rights and concentrate on self-improvement and preparation for equality. All right? So don't make a lot of noise, don't protest, don't raise hell, but improve yourself and prepare for equality. Okay? And basically he says, don't be black, basically, or be as white as you can, and then whites will accept you. Okay. And that's probably part of a successful strategy, but I don't think it's the whole strategy. And we'll talk about Du Bois in another chapter or two. But you can see how that carries over to Martin Luther King's nonviolence. Martin Luther King is no Booker T. Washington. He's a much more active fighter for civil rights. But for people like Malcolm X and others in the Black Power movement, he was kind of their version of Booker T, if you understand what I'm saying. Okay. They then talk about Jim Crow, which I always find amusing. Jim Crow was a character in the minstrel shows. There was a song and a dance. One of the very popular performers in minstrel shows did an act called Jim Crow. Okay. Now, minstrel shows are bizarre in the first place because it's white people putting black makeup on to look like African Americans, but they don't really look like African Americans. They look like some caricature of African Americans. And then they do all these jokes and stuff that are sort of demeaning to African Americans. But at the same time, they pretend that they're playing plantation songs and with plantation instruments, and the plantation becomes this exotic place. It's very bizarre. And what's probably the strangest thing is that at the end of the 19th century, by the 1880s or so, actual African Americans are performing in minstrel shows. But audiences don't want to see actual African Americans on the stage. So black people have to black up themselves in order to appear in their minstrel shows and be accepted. So you have actual black people pretending to be white people who are pretending to be black people. And I think that's really a clue to the racial psychosis of America there. All right, so Jim Crow laws, basically the Supreme Court rules that, no less a body than the Supreme Court rules that separate but equal is okay, it's constitutional. They do that in 1896. The case is Plessy versus Ferguson. Before that, they've kind of stripped the 14th and 15th Amendments of much of their significance. They say basically those laws, those amendments apply to the state and the federal government, not to ordinary people. So ordinary people can discriminate as much as they want. There's a case in 1899, Cumming versus County Board of Education. The court ruled that communities could establish schools for whites only, even if there were no comparable schools for blacks. Great. Okay. Now, so what you have here is a huge population of black people in the South that under slavery was sort of controlled for the most part by their masters and the overseers, okay? The masters had the right to discipline their slaves by whipping or beating them up, all that kind of thing. And now you have a large population that you want to keep down, not let them vote, not let them have a say in the government, not let them enjoy the equal education, and et cetera, et cetera. And the question is, how do you do that? And one of the ways that it's done is terror. The South in slavery was clearly like a fascist state. It was a military camp. You had to constantly, it's like if half the population were convicts and the whole state was a giant prison. That's you need a lot of guards. You need a lot of guns, and you need a lot of guards. And after slavery, it's a similar problem. You have the Ku Klux Klan doing their night riding thing, threatening to burn people and stuff like that. But one of the most important means of keeping the black population unbalanced or unstable is lynching. Okay? Now, I was watching something the other night. There's a certain point after the Civil War where the majority of lynching victims are now black. Previous to that, the majority had been white, which makes sense because whites are the majority of the population overall. Okay, but lynching is it's an instrument of terror. People can be accused of lynching for all sorts of slight infractions. I'm sure in some cases the person actually had committed a crime, but in a lot of cases it's false charges of rape or no charge of rape, but you just saw something, you whistled it. Emmett Till gets not hanged, but he gets killed because he came from Chicago, I think, to Mississippi and whistled at a white woman. Okay? So, a guy that a black man that doesn't step off the sidewalk and let the white pass through can be lynched. Anybody can be lynched. Men, women, children. This goes on year after year after year. And it would be a giant event. People would bring picnic baskets and take pictures. There were postcards printed up of various lynchings. And you can go on the internet and look around. There's a bunch of YouTubes about lynching, and there are lots and lots of photos because people took lots and lots of photos. And that is basically, in a situation where even if you're doing everything right, you can still be lynched. That's pretty terrifying, And we don't have lynching anymore. But we do have this other thing where, the cop stops you and next thing you know, you have 7 bullets in your back, or a knee on your neck for minutes and minutes. It's kind of a very similar thing. It keeps the population. Like, how do you prevent yourself, if you're black, how do you prevent yourself from getting killed by the cops? They stop lawyers. They stop people, they stop politicians who are black. What are you doing driving this car, you know? So, I don't know. So it's important to dig into some of that. They finally passed an anti-lynching law at the federal level. I think it was only in 2013. And all that time before that, they couldn't get it passed because the Southerners sort of went against it. They kind of wanted to hang on to it, I guess. Okay? So you have to figure 1870, 1880s, 1890s, 1900, 1910, World War I, the 20s. There's black people are moving to the north. The 30s, there's a depression. It hits black people harder. The 40s, they go off to World War II, but it's still segregated units in the military. In fact, the Marines only get their first African-American Marine in like 43 or something, 42. Howard Perry. And then in the 50s, almost 100 years after the Emancipation and in the 13th Amendment, people start to push for their civil rights again, okay? And it really, I mean, legally, the Voting Rights Act gets passed in 1965. It takes a little time after that for blacks to really be able to register and be an effective voting body, okay? So, and what happens in the textbook is the first 4 or 5 chapters are all the same time period from different angles, okay? So black people play a big role in Reconstruction, and then they kind of disappear. There's a, you know, they pop in here and there, and then in the 60s it'll come in again, all right? But I want you to keep in mind that when we're studying, I don't know, populism and this, that, and the other thing, the South is still in this condition of segregation and lynching terror and those kinds of things, all right? If you have any questions, send me an email, stclairpa@sunyroom.edu, and I'm gonna work on getting an actual what do you call it? Some kind of synchronous class meeting, because I don't like talking into the air. And we'll see if we can do that. I'll have to make an announcement and stuff, but I have to learn some other stuff on Blackboard. Okay. All right. Have a good day. See you soon.